the Chinese government. The Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, spent the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak destroying testing samples, intimidating doctors, expelling journalists, hiding information, lying to the world. You know, Mr. President, it's so interesting that they still have not let the scientists from the CDC into that Wuhan virology lab. They still don't want anybody in there. They lied to everybody about how dangerous this was, and they did that on purpose. Think about it, an intentional act of deception. An intentional act of deception. Repeated acts by the Chinese Communist Party to hide something that was an outbreak and try to keep it from the world. This seems inconceivable that a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a former and likely future member of the Human Rights Council would be so careless with the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. But they did it. But if you consider their track record, it does start to make sense, because China is not a new problem. It is just a newly recognized problem, and I fear America has forgotten the lessons we learned as we watched the communist dogma burn its way through Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia, twisting the minds of ambitious men who leveraged political mass murder as a messaging tool, killing tens of millions of innocent people in the process. During the Cold War, the divide between the Soviet bloc and the West was pretty clear. We could see that alignment with the Soviets, see that that would derail our global fight for democracy. We also caught glimpses of Mao's China, where upwards of 30 million people died of starvation, disease, and directly at the hands of party officials. Not an appreciation for the sanctity of life. One of our first principles and tenets. Today, the Chinese Communist Party is still following that Soviet playbook, and it's time for the world to remember what that means before time runs out. Although Xi Jinping and the CCP have modernized their methods, they're all about cyber, they're all about technology. Here's what we have to remember. Their philosophy and their goals are exactly the same. They want to dominate the world, militarily, economically, politically. They are wanting domination, and they will step over and run over whatever gets in their way. What we have to do is to remember that China is capable of funneling mass amounts of cash, equipment, and physical support to developing countries. They're doing it all in exchange for loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party's agenda. For example, debt diplomacy schemes, that's their new thing. Debt diplomacy schemes have ensnared Sri Lanka and Djibouti and other countries in Africa and Asia. Those countries have in turn opened the doors to strategically important ports and waterways and granted access to valuable natural resources. To be clear, these are not aid programs. They are tools of manipulation offered to nations in desperate circumstances. For nations not in desperate circumstances, Beijing has to work a little harder, but they still are working to get the job done. They count on the promise of cheap labor and production and low-cost products to open doors with nations that normally are not going to work with somebody with such an abysmal human rights record as China has. The world is recalling some very hard lessons right now, but there's a path forward. We must secure our supply chains, and we must begin to return these critical infrastructure supply chains to the United States to make certain that we can bolster ourselves and that we're not completely dependent on China for some items that are essential for us. The pharmaceutical supply chain is one where I have focused with Senator Menendez with our SAMC legislation. This week, Senator McSally and Senator Daines and I introduced the Stopkovat Act to hold China legally liable for the damage caused by the spread of the novel coronavirus. Our colleagues have other pieces of legislation that are the same focus: accountability for China and making certain this doesn't happen to us again. And I encourage all of my colleagues to look at these. And I also encourage my colleagues to accept that our relationship with China is broken right now, and that it was never that great to begin with, but right now it is broken. It is time for us to realize that we have to treat China as an adversary, and we have to protect ourselves as we move forward. I yield the floor.